Welcome everybody to another episode of the Dragonus Podcastus. I am the Law, and with me is Lord and Master Byron.
Yes.
If you guys
All
like,
will fear.
sorry,
All will fear me.
yes, all will fear you, and
And
also
subscribe to our Patreon.
and also respect, because you can't have fear without some level of respect. So if you guys like our show and want to support us, you can do so at patreon.com/Dragonus Podcastus. Eventually, at some point, we will get the bingo card going, and we may include bloopers because there are a lot of bloopers for this particular episode. But speaking of the law, our episode today is talking about probably the most lawful class, which is the Paladin. Now, I have a few things to say about the Paladin, but I'm going to save that for kind of the end, because my opinion has kind of changed from when I originally dreamt up this little opinion of mine. But, Byron, so what would you say is, just going into our regular format here, what would you say is okay. Let me rephrase that. What is your experience with the Paladin class?
I've actually played a couple of different Paladins. And I'm currently in an every other week game. Again, playing a Paladin.
Yeah, see, I don't have much experience with Paladins, but I do have other alternative ways of playing a Paladin. Like, I play Elden Ring, and I actually am building a Paladin build. But, so going into our usual format again, what would you say is the main selling point of the class?
So, Paladins deal a lot of damage. They can also heal their enemies in certain circumstances. This is definitely not their main focus. Their main focus is absolutely their damage output, or DPS. Smites are extra damage that Paladins can add when they hit. It can only be done in melee. So there's kind of a trade-off there. When a Paladin, enters the fray, they are making themselves a target, but they get a lot of buffs in response to that. So they usually can wear heavy armor, they've got auras to protect them and things like that. The main thing, I think, is really smites. They deal a lot of damage. And fun fact, you can choose to add a smite after you see what you rolled on your attack roll. So if you roll a crit, you can choose to add a smite. And rules is written, if you do players, rules is written, when you roll a critical hit, you double all your damage dice. Weapon damage, smite damage, all of it is all doubled. So Paladins can deal a ton of damage.
Yeah. Just kind of getting a misconception out of the way. So their smite damage works on pretty much anything, right? It doesn't have it can, but would you say that the class originally was like an anti-undead class, or was it more like just anti-evil?
Yeah, I think that it was meant to be more like a Holy Crusader kind of a type, very similar to a cleric, but thankfully, as the editions have progressed, I think they have both found their own niche, and they have different roles in a party, so a paladin and a cleric do different things, and it's totally possible to have both in the same party, but the Divine Smites deal damage to anything, but they do extra damage to undead and fiend. So there you go.
Okay. All right. So, given how much the class is basically the tank of the party. So, ideally, the idea would be that if when you play the paladin, you're playing usually the tank, but from my understanding, that's not always the case. That's kind of a generalization.
Yeah, so you don't have to play a paladin that goes into the fray that, is a melee attacker or anything like that, but a lot of the smites do say that you have to deal melee damage, or you
Not
have to be wielding a melee weapon to use those smites. So that is something to keep in mind if you're choosing to play a paladin.
Not everybody can be a Leroy Jenkins.
That's true.
So what's so in terms of like their healing abilities, they have their lay on hands, which
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, how much does that actually heal? Because
Well, Go ahead.
I've always been confused about, like, is it like a D4? Is it a D6?
So it's actually none of those.
Oh,
The way that lay on hands works is you start with a pool, and you can choose to spend as many as you want when you heal somebody out of that pool. And I believe it's 5 per paladin level. Yeah, 5 per paladin level. So when you start off as a first level paladin, you have 5 points in your lay on hands pool. And when you heal someone, you can choose to heal them between 1 and 5. Or if you spend 5 points from the pool, you can cure any one disease or neutralize poison. So
that's pretty powerful.
it's very strong, and if you're playing a paladin, or when I play, I like to keep 5 points in my pool until kind of the end of the day. That way, if somebody does get poisoned or disease, we always have a backup. Or if somebody is about to die, you can always give them just 1, right? If they're at 0, you can give them 1 hit point from your lay on hands pool and bring them up, and then they could either heal themselves or at least stop making death saving throws. That can be very powerful.
That's very helpful, especially
Yeah.
in dungeons.
Uh-huh.
So okay, and the other selling point of the paladin is their sacred oath. Now, just kind of comparing and contrasting here, when a paladin in 5th edition takes a sacred oath, they get a bunch of extra benefits based on their which oath they're taking. But in older editions, it was a lot different.
Yeah.
One thing is that paladins in older editions had to be lawful good, and if they deviated in any capacity from that, they lose their paladin status and just become well, let's say you're a level 10 paladin, if you deviate from lawful good in any capacity, you lose your paladin status and you become a level 10 fighter. The only way to get that back was to go through, I believe it was called repentance, but thankfully they've changed that because of the existence of, all of these other mechanics. But it's I say, like, if you're gonna play a paladin but you don't want to be like lawful good, like neutral good's the ideal way to go.
And another thing from earlier editions that's changed is that the paladin does not have to have a connection to a god, deity, or temple of any kind. With the implementation of the oaths that they brought in 5th edition, that's kind of like your crusade, you might say. That's your allegiance, right? The paladin's allegiance is to their oath, not to a god. So you can play as an agnostic or an atheist paladin, who is fighting for justice and peace. Maybe, they are a champion of orphans or something like that, right? But then they also have the ability to have more backstory options with that. You're not necessarily a religious person. The character is not necessarily religious, right? When you play as a paladin. So I think that's opened up a lot of options for people who choose to play paladins.
I agree with that strongly because the common stereotype and generalization was that paladins in older editions, they used to be like super duper religious because they devoted themselves to a god. But now you don't necessarily have to devote yourself. Hell, you could be you could devote yourself to like not just one god, but like a pantheon of gods. Like you could devote yourself to like um Hindu gods or Buddhist
Yeah.
gods. It's crazy how that works. Um but by and far the most interesting, definitely the most interesting thing about the Paladin is how they have their own unique spell list, which in older editions they took from the Cleric spell list, but now they have their own unique spell list. Thank goodness. Um, all right, so let's go into the actual oaths. So devotion is basically as it says, it's devotion to a single, to say a group of people like orphans, for example, or to an idea, or some kind of principle,
Huh?
which is very honorable. Which is probably, if I was gonna play a paladin, I'd probably go oaths of devotion, oaths of the ancients. So that's, let me just double check my notes here. That's basically you're devoting yourself to nature, I think.
And, well, my understanding was ancestors, sort of.
Oh, okay.
But I could see that too.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, that actually does kind of make a lot of sense too. Oath of Vengeance. So basically, well, somebody did a really bad thing and you were swearing vengeance upon them. However, righteous vengeance, not like vengeance in terms of like malicious or cruel um irony or cruel karma. So
Right.
basically, it would be something. Another name for it would be the Oath of Karma.
So maybe somebody killed your dog and you want to get revenge.
We don't talk about that. No, no.
Oh, no. Okay, okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. I mean, it totally makes sense, but um, except when we get into famous paladins, we'll talk about that. But I have a lot to
Sure.
say. Oath of Glory. So basically, you be you're kind of looking for not fame and fortune, but you're kind of seeking like prestige in a sense,
Yeah, definitely. You want to make a name for yourself.
but not for the sake of like materialism. So like not
Right.
wealth and riches. Watcher. So basically, bodyguard.
Yeah, a little bit. Kind of like I mean, if they had been trained with more martial powers, the Watchers from Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, if you kind of think about it. But I think of them as guardians, overseers, people who are, watching the helpless, that sort of thing.
Okay. Conquest. So basically, war. But from what I read from the description, it basically is like you can't have peace without a little bit of, without some manner of order and control, which is definitely, this is probably the neutral evil oath based on what I've read.
Uh, I would say neutral, potentially.
Okay. And then redemption is where, well, you've maybe done a bad thing and you're looking for um a, a way to repent, or you're redeeming somebody else, or you're just, you're just a humble person who just wants to um keep the peace.
Yep.
All right, so that takes us into famous paladins. So the big ones are definitely, well, the big one that we know about is definitely the, from real history, is the Knights Templar. However, that one's kind of debatable because we don't know a full lot about what they did. But the one that's a lot in question is Joan of Arc. I'd say she definitely has the characteristics of a paladin. Whether or not she actually existed or it was just a folk tale is completely up to uh, interpretation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. It may have just been over exaggerated a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, well, Judge Dredd, obviously. Now they take. I believe this would be like Oath of Vengeance plus a little bit of maybe a little bit of Oath of Conquest, maybe, but he both versions follow the law to the letter. But I think Carl Urban's uh Judge Dredd is a little more fair when it comes to handing out sentences, and he's not like he is perfectly willing to talk and rather let the words first before action, which is important. Well, you have Captain America, which is also devotion, which is I say he's devoted more to like the idea of America or just loyalty to his friends, that kind of thing. Wonder Woman is an interesting one because she takes on aspects of the Oath of the Ancients, which I agree. Sometimes that it depends on interpretation, but I think that she is probably the most she definitely has aspects of a paladin, but I would say she's a combination of three classes put together into one. Um, I don't want to even talk about Charlemagne because that's a totally different story. The bride is from Kill Bill is Oath of Vengeance because, well, she was quote unquote killed, put into a coma, and she was betrayed by her colleagues, and she carved through a lot of guys, a lot of people, and she plucked somebody's eye out. So that's fun. Now this one in particular, this next one, I really enjoy because this one was one of my favorite live action movies. The live action Disney version of The Three Musketeers, which has Charlie Sheen, Chris O'Donnell, Oliver Platt, and Kiefer Sutherland, and Tim Curry. Now, they specifically say that, well, when Cyclops, aka Captain Rochefort, is trying to arrest them, and Athos says, "You go back and you tell the Cardinal that we will continue to perform our sworn duty." I think it's more of a question of, I think it's more of a case of they're performing, like, because they were recruited to be, well, elite soldiers, but the musketeers were also the king's bodyguards. So, and they use every manner of their power to fight against the evil cardinal. That includes, but is not limited to, deception, maybe blowing up a few things, stealing the cardinal's carriage. But all in all, it's a good interpretation, and I think it's worthy of proclaiming them paladins. Um, this one here is kind of interesting. The Jedi and or Darth Vader. That one. Now, Darth Vader is a little bit of a weird one because order. I would say he's either an oath of vengeance or an oath of conquest paladin. As for the Jedi, I think they're either oath of redemption or oath of devotion. I think that would be the most accurate. I think. And then finally, we got RoboCop. RoboCop is oath of devotion, most definitely. What do you think? Sorry, one second. I think,
Oh,
but sorry. Okay, sorry.
small technical difficulties. But I would say that Darth Vader is a good example of Oath of Conquest, as he's trying to rule the entire galaxy.
Yeah, that too. But I also see bits of Oath of Devotion just a little bit because he's devoted to his emperor.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he's perfectly willing to kill his own soldiers because when they screw up. Now, that may be a sign of cruelty to some, but it's actually practical because if you have an incompetent commander who keeps mucking up, then there's no point. You can either sack them or, in Vader's case, just force choke them, which is interesting. RoboCop is a good example of probably he's I think he's either Oath of Devotion or Oath of Vengeance because of his story, which it's interesting. Um, yeah. Other than that, oh, well, in general, well, the Jedi are definitely, well, they're also devotion most likely. My only thing is that there are some Jedi who take on a different approach, as opposed to being uh re- regular oaths of devotion. They're just, regular old paladins. There's nothing too special about them. Um, I do admit though, there is a bit of a there's a bit of a gap between what separates a regular Jedi from a Jedi Master, but we don't have to go into that.
Hmm.
All right, so now that we're got that all the way, I gotta go on a bit of a rant here, and I apologize. But basically, so when I first started playing D&D and I was made aware of the Paladin, basically when I read up on it, I thought, well, there's a bunch of these downsides about how, like, for example, as we've stated before, in older editions, they had a bunch of, like, set rules where they couldn't deviate from lawful good, and if they did, they lose their paladinship. Also, while paladins do have to give away, like, 25% of their treasure. Now, that may be a flavor thing, but it's still kind of, it was written in the rules, and I was kind of against that a little bit. Not that I don't disagree with giving away your treasure, but 25%? We got to pay the bills here, people.
Well,
Um
the rules have come a long way now.
thank goodness. Yes. And also because paladins, like back in the early days, I always saw them as kind of anti-undead because of the way their powers and their abilities were tailored. Um, Now granted, the cleric has the ability to actually turn undead, but a paladin would realistically in that situation be one of the few that can actually kill an undead and keep it dead. But I've come to realize that paladins are just are a very worthy class, and they may not they I may have my issues with them from past editions, but going forward, fifth edition has definitely improved that.
Hmm.
And and me personally, I enjoy the flavor of a paladin. Um, okay, so Byron, anything you wanna add before we wrap up?
Yeah, just that you don't have to play as a lawful good character if you choose to play a paladin. That's absolutely your choice. In earlier editions, uh, the character alignment mattered a lot more. Fifth edition, it's really more of a flavor thing. But I've enjoyed playing a paladin when I've done it. It's fun to smite things, and deal a lot of extra damage when the moment calls for it, and being able to provide, buff auras and things like that to your allies has always been great. Layout hands is a really nice feature that really no other class really gets. So Paladin is a fun one if you want to hit things hard, and do it with a righteous fury.
Yeah, as we call it, registry. Just also remember that there are evil paladins out there.
Yep.
Anyway, we'll see you guys next week. Next week will be a surprise. We'll see you guys next week.